Welcome to this joint Policy Exchange Conservative Home event on One Nation After COVID. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, and I'd like to thank my friend Dean Godson of Policy Exchange for allowing me to chair this event today. Just a few housekeeping points at the beginning. First of all, sadly, apologies from Isaac Levido, who is unable to join us. What I'm going to do in a few moments is go to each of our other four panellists, introducing them separately. They'll have 5 minutes each. I'll then ask them a few questions. It's over to you, and we'll aim to wrap up at about 1:15. This is obviously a very timely moment to have this discussion, I think, for at least three reasons. First of all, because any debate about or discussion about One Nation isn't simply a matter for England, it's a matter for the whole United Kingdom. So it's very good to have both Arlene and Kirsten here in this discussion. Next, with what happened at the election last year, with the red wall or the blue wall, as we're now meant to call it, and all that, a discussion of what One Nation is and means now is very timely. And third, just to strike a contemporary note, all this could scarcely be more relevant at a time when we gather the government is at a reset moment. So do raise your virtual hands if you want to ask a question. And without any more ado, I'm going to go over to our first speaker, who is Danny Kruger, MP for Devizes, and talking of what goes on in Downing Street, formerly Boris Johnson's political secretary. So Danny, One Nation After COVID, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and good to be with you all. I thought I would just set out what I take the One Nation label to mean and how it applies to our time. And I interpret it as having two strands. There are two aspects to the One Nation tradition, which are complementary and aligned, but can often appear in tension. So the first one, and this harks back to the to our roots as a political movement before Disraeli, who came up with the phrase in the 18th century, when the idea of being liberal was to be generous in spirit, to have a magnanimous attitude to one's fellow countrymen and women, and the sense that there was an obligation on those with power and wealth to share it and to act in the national interest. And that's the spirit of One Nation. And we saw it through, obviously most famously through Disraeli's social reforms in the 1870s, and then also post-war with Churchill and Macmillan and their contribution to the post-war settlement. And then in our time with particularly David Cameron and his focus on having a Conservative Party that was at ease with the nation as it is, and avoiding a sort of backward-looking or reactionary tone. So that's the One Nation, in a sense, just means a generous spirit, and which I think we need. And the other aspect to it, perhaps more substantially, and this does have this directly I trace to Disraeli, is the notion of trusting the people, which of course was his great line. And it might seem like an obvious or cliched statement to make now, but for Disraeli, and for the Conservative Party in his time, it was a very radical statement, and he was opposed tooth and nail by a considerable portion of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, known as the Adulamites for some reason. So they inhabited the cave of Adullam. And they were the reactionaries who basically said, you don't trust the people because the people can't be trusted to know what's good for them. And moreover, if you do trust them, they're not going to thank you for it. And the political argument made, and Disraeli was arguing for extending the franchise and involving more people in giving more people a vote. The Adulamites said, well, they'll never vote for us, they'll vote for the Liberals. Most immediately they did, actually, after the Second Reform Act. But then, over the next generation, an enormous event happened, which was the working men and women of Britain just came to the Conservative Party in droves. And we formed this mass movement, the greatest mass political movement ever at that stage. that spirit of trusting the people carried on through the 20th century, and of course Margaret Thatcher represented it in sort of trusting the entrepreneurial instincts. And then in our time, and this is why I claim Brexit for the One Nation tradition, because that was a fundamental statement of trust in the people and in our country. And of course, it involves some political violence, and this is where the trusting the people agenda sometimes appears in contrast to the generous spirit that I referred to. And sometimes, as my colleague John Hayes puts it, you have to be fierce in defence of the gentle. And my interpretation of what we did this time last year, even though many of my colleagues who wear the One Nation label very proudly disagreed with it, did involve some political violence. But we were, as we saw it, and I see it now very clearly in retrospect, what we were trying to do was to defend the country against the twin threats of Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage, two extremely un-One Nation actors, and against an alliance, the Remain alliance in Parliament and in parts of our constitution, in the civil service in particular, who didn't want to trust the people. They didn't want to see Brexit done. And so that's where we've got to. We're going forward, what does trusting the people look like? And I'll end with this. For me, I am enormously inspired by what we've seen this country do during the lockdown. I'm not talking about the travails of government, but what the public have done, what the people have done in their communities. And we have, and frontline public service professionals and local people have come together in the most amazing way. And I think trusting the people now looks like building on that, this new spirit of can-do local action. And we need to devolve power very dramatically and dismantle the great bureaucracies which constrain frontline professionals and people in our neighbourhoods from taking back control of the systems which affect them. So for me, One Nation in the next stage is a generous spirit, but a radical devolution agenda. Back to you, Paul.
Danny, thank you very much. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Arlene Foster, First Minister of Northern Ireland, leader of the DUP. Arlene, welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Paul, and it's good to be back on a policy exchange platform, albeit virtually, and very much looking forward to the time when we can meet again in Great George's Street with you all. Politics and life in our country can proceed for a number of years with what seems like little change, but these past 4 years in the United Kingdom has certainly not been short of drama of one sort or another. And globally, again, politics in many Western democracies has also been reshaped. Globalism and the long-term consequences of the 2007 financial collapse manifested themselves in a series of political shocks. And to me, the key driver for the reshaping was a desire for both cultural and economic security that, frankly, society did not see existing politics deliver or indeed caring about at that time. I don't actually believe that COVID has affected these fundamentals. In fact, COVID's likely to have reinforced them. And if you look at some of the academic commentary on this, some like Robert Putnam see it as a cyclical process moving from self to society, then back to self again, whilst others like Michael Lind in a probably darker analysis speaks to that metropolitan overreach followed by a populist backlash. So whichever of those you prefer and whichever of those you look at, I think more than ever, conservatism needs to address where we are. And for me, One Nation Conservatism provides an answer to our current challenges. In fact, it's probably the only workable mainstream answer to either of the cycles that I've referred to. And it is, of course, so important that we do engage on this platform because, as we've seen back in 2017 with the Corbyn surge, it showed that if conservatism doesn't provide an answer to the public, it may be open to a hard left option. So I just wanted to make 3 points as to what I mean by One Nation Conservatism, coming as I do from Northern Ireland. For me, it has 3 pillars. First of all, unsurprisingly, conserving the United Kingdom. And Conservatism has, unfortunately, I think, taken the union of its four constituent parts for granted for too long, whether that's the institutions, the relationships, Britishness itself. And that, unfortunately, is a complacency which our opponents have taken advantage of. Conservatism's leadership instincts have been very much focused on London, and we need to see tangible evidence that commitments made to move away from that, and there have been commitments to move away from that, are followed through on. Because as far as I can see, for some One Nation Conservatives, they imagine it's barely all of England, never mind the whole of the United Kingdom. And so we need to think of how we defend and actually support and promote the union. For some, the defence of the United Kingdom is very mechanistic. They talk about, obviously, the economic advantages of being within the union. And of course, the numbers are very obvious, very brutal, very powerful. But we need a broader emotional connection and ambition for it to be more of the ambition, which I want to talk about in my third point. But in practical terms, I'm talking about issues such as truly national infrastructure plans, promotion of pan-United Kingdom ties, connections, cultures, all of those things. The second pillar of One Nation Conservatism for me is the people, and this is where I cross over a little with Danny's point, because one of the fundamental flaws with Blairism was that it didn't transform the areas of the countries which had declined. Instead, it made it somebody else's problem, devolution, or indeed subsidised the areas without any real strategic plan for the future. And of course, pumping money into an area only works for as long as that money keeps coming. And when the global collapse disrupted all of that, then the subsidised areas themselves were back where they had started again. And I think you're seeing a little bit of the disruption of that in the north of England, of course. So people are what makes the nation. And if we are not enabling our people to advance, then we're not enabling our nation to advance. And again, in terms of practical policy terms, you're looking about making better shifts in training and in education, instead of having sporadic interventions, having long-term plans to deal with those sorts of areas, particularly in education. The third pillar, very briefly, then, Paul, I wanted to finish off with was the ambition for our One Nation. And I think we're really lacking in this pillar. It's definitely not, to be clear, the premise that we go back to empire. We don't, we couldn't, even if we wanted to. However, a permanent diet of management of decline is not an acceptable alternative. And our past, particularly true for us here in Northern Ireland, is not for consolation, but it is actually for inspiration. As you know, our centenary is next year, and when you look back to the creation of Northern Ireland, there's so much to be so very proud of. So we need to level up areas that once thrived, and then they succeeded in the past, get them to succeed again, and then when that happens, we will truly have a One Nation. So Paul, that's my commentary for today.
Eileen, thank you very much. We're now going to go to Jane Stevenson, MP for Wolverhampton North East. Jane, you're probably tired by now of hearing people talking about the red wall or the blue wall, as I gather we're now meant to call it, and all that. But you are one of the new MPs who's elected in what's usually been a Labour seat last December. So I'm very glad you're here to be able to join us to talk now about what you think about One Nation in the context of the seat you've been elected for in the area you represent.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, my seat has only been Conservative once before in 1987, Wolverhampton North East. It's my home city. I grew up next door in Wolverhampton South West, which does have a more Conservative tradition, but has gone more Labour over the past couple of decades. Just a brief background to the problems we face in Wolverhampton and why I think this big switch happened. We have high unemployment, we have extremely high youth unemployment, we have social issues, we have deprivation, and there has been a lot of support for Brexit. So that was undoubtedly the main factor in a lot of the Black Country seats switching to Conservative seats. People put faith in the Prime Minister. They did like his messages of levelling up at the risk of talking in sound bites during this. But I think people have felt the phrase that stuck with me was talent is evenly spread around the country, but opportunity certainly isn't. And I think rather than focus on Disraeli and going back to the origins of one nation conservatism, I want to focus a little bit more on Boris and his attitude towards it. So how I keep faith with my voters and how we justify their faith in the Conservatives at the last election, it is levelling up opportunity to me that's really important. Arlene mentioned education, and as the daughter of a teacher, I would always go back to that. I really want to see, it goes back to that awful school assembly about give a man a fish or give a man a fishing rod. And certainly with the economic challenges we face after the pandemic, we need fishing rod solutions. We need to invest in areas that to provide solutions. So some good news in my constituency are things like the National Brownfield Institute, which is going to reclaim industrial land for green home buildings. They're going to be technical jobs. They're going to be construction jobs, engineering jobs. And I think that levelling up is so important and focused on how we perpetuate an economy locally. And that will only happen by getting unemployment levels down. I think training and jobs, we hear the Kickstart scheme, the lifelong skills guarantee, those things are really important to me. How we keep those voters, I don't know. We'll learn at the next election whether the blue wall will stay blue or if it will turn a little bit pink again. But I think if we're going to have a long-term new Conservative base, we have to allow people to pull themselves up by education, a little bit of investment. I think when we arrived in Westminster en masse last December, we had such high hopes of probably splashing the cash policies. I don't think we're going to see that going forward. I think there are going to have to be more pragmatic solutions. I think there's going to be less immediate money. And the other thing I'd like to just raise is some of these solutions are much longer term than one parliament. They're much longer term than a decade. So there are immediate things we can do with training institutes, with immediate investment. But then we need to think mid-term and long-term about early years education, about how we help entrepreneurs, how we help people in research and development, in innovation. All of those kind of industrial areas need that support. And I think people see a lot of barriers from where they are now to where they want to be, to achieve and to aspire to a better sort of quality of life. So those are just initial thoughts about areas like Wolverhampton and the Black Country. I think voters on the doorstep in December naturally are quite conservative. They love Queen and Country. They really love our union. My father was Northern Irish. We have a big Irish community in Wolverhampton. And I think those traditional values are really important to working class voters in Wolverhampton. And I hope our party will be adjusting itself to be the party of normal working people, which Labour, I don't think, has been over the last few years. I think people in my seat connect Labour with London, they connect it with Islington, with a sort of woke agenda, and they don't identify, if you come into one of my pubs with me, which any of you is very welcome to do, well, not at the moment, but after the 1st and 2nd of December, you will meet people who do share Conservative values. They don't connect, certainly not with Jeremy Corbyn, and I don't think really with Keir Starmer. So I'm reasonably hopeful in our red wall, blue wall, Black Country seats, that we can, as a party, embrace these new voters and become that party for normal working people. So those are my initial comments.
Red, blue and black, Jane, thank you very much. And now, Kirsten Hare, former MP for Angus, but very much in the heart of what's happening in the Conservative Party in Scotland as senior advisor to Douglas Ross. And of course, we've the Scottish elections coming up next year, and the potential threat, if the SNP had their way anyway, of a second independence referendum. So with that rather gaunt introduction, Kirstine, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and to Policy Exchange for inviting me to join the panel today for this really important event around a really important topic, ensuring that, of course, the Conservative Party looks out and works for every part of the country is something that I've been passionate about prior to joining the Green Benches in 2017, and indeed, as you outlined there, Paul, since I left them. And I think that this is a really timely event because, obviously, I mentioned your introduction, also with this glimmer of hope provided by, a number of vaccines, it just feels like we need to discuss about how, the party works and how the government governs in a post-COVID world where things start to very gradually progress back into sort of some form of normality. And indeed, in every crisis lies an opportunity, and where the people of the United Kingdom have been kind of reflecting on their lives and their lifestyles and the way that their life was prior to COVID and the way that it is now, taking stock about whether it is indeed the life that we want going forward. Party and government also need to take that time to recognise that they sort of can't continue to work in the way that they have done previously, because so much has changed in such an incredibly short time scale. And after over 20 years of devolution, in Scotland, where I believe that devolution is very much a process rather than an event, but a lot has happened over that time. We have seen devolution play out in practice. We've seen different governments in Westminster, indeed different compositions of governments and different governments within the devolved administrations. We see our departure from the European Union and, of course, still fighting a global pandemic. And I believe really firmly at this point that the party must now take stock, what's working and what isn't working. So through devolution, of course, decisions are made at local level through the devolved administrations, and quite rightly so, because therefore that's where the responsibility and indeed accountability lies. But the UK government has supported each nation in a whole host of different ways. And of course, we might come on to speak about it, but there's a separate matter around, I suppose, how well they have conveyed that support. But we have seen the strength of the UK working together, and it has been said already, it's not just about the economic support, but it is that kind of cultural ties that we've seen over the past few really difficult months. But the pandemic has shown, without a doubt, that the sheer strength of the union, safeguarding hundreds of thousands of jobs in Scotland, and over 80,000 Scottish businesses supported by government-backed grants and loans. We had the armed forces out delivering testing to the more remote parts of Scotland. We have the UK government delivering over 60% of Scotland's testing. We've seen an extraordinary effort from the UK government to deliver, not just in Scotland, of course, but in each devolved nation across the United Kingdom. That's what the union's all about. It's about pooling and sharing of resources, pooling together when times get tough, and times haven't really been tougher than the last few months. And yeah, there's maybe some people, when I talk about the union, talk about Scotland and some of the difficulties and challenges that we pose, and there might be people watching that think, there's a really valid question around, if Scotland had voted yes in 2014, there was a very shaky economic argument back then, and indeed even weaker now. Where would that support have come from? How many jobs would have been saved? Where would that funding have come from to pump into our NHS, to build new facilities? Where would that money have come from to support businesses through the vital grants that have been supported? And these are important questions, not questions for now, because we should be focusing on the recovery process and nothing else, but they are on the mind of many Scots that voted no in 2014. But if you look at the polls, and they are quite stark, I can read a poll as well as anyone else can, and they do show, Paul, as you outlined, a strong support for the SNP in Scotland. And the UK government really need to realise that the culture that has been created post-devolution through successive governments, that it has to change. So whether that's devolve and forget, whether it's we look at, we do have poor communications from the UK government with it, across each nation of the UK. We need to be much more imaginative around policy making, even more so now because of the constraints that we have that have been outlined by previous speakers, and ensuring that implications of policy, we understand the implications of that policy on all 4 nations of the country. So really, ensuring that our union is thread through every government department. And also, I think everybody wants to see more working between the UK government and the devolved administrations. And just speaking, around Scotland, I just feel really strongly that the UK government, the Conservative Party, need to really step up to calm the rise of nationalism in Scotland. I mean, that's the fundamental of one nation conservatism, which, let's not forget, it's not just appeared. This has been climbing steadily for some time now, and it is a great challenge in Scotland, and I think that it's something that we have to deal with head on. We do have an election in May, and it's about the Scottish Conservative Party, which is obviously has separate policies and separate policy agenda to the wider UK party, really setting out its stall. That the Scottish Conservative Party is there to give a fresh new agenda, an alternative agenda. It's not about separation; it's about focusing on the pandemic recovery.
Kirsten, thank you very much. I'm going to try one question on each of you, and then we'll go to questions from everyone else. And once again, can I remind viewers to raise a virtual hand, and you may well get called to ask a question, I hope. Danny, let me start with you. I was very interested in what you had to say at the start about magnanimity, and you painted a lovely historical picture and applied it to today. I mean, it's just a question that arises, which is this very gentle, elevated, rather sort of noble politics that you were outlining. Does it feel a bit out of place, not in one nation, but in a politics that's full of social media war, Twitter attacks, MPs being urged to get it stuck into Keir Starmer on the most brutal terms? It seemed to me that the politics you were offering was rather ennobling, but I'm not sure I hear a lot of it today.
Well, PMQs is often a bit of a bear pit, and yet actually Parliament can, if people watch normal debates, they think they would see that politicians can speak respectfully to each other across the aisle, and we can speak respectfully of each other in public as well. I mean, we've got to be, I don't believe in a sort of cozy consensus. We need to be tough and use tough language often because we're trying to involve the country. If we all just decided to gang up in a little cozy club in Westminster, we wouldn't be doing our job. But that doesn't mean that we have to be vicious. But mostly I'm talking in a grander political sense, that our mission as in politics and our party should be generous spirited, and it should be inclusive and engaging, and it should and I don't like put the politics of our people. I think we should be governing for everybody, and we should very clearly communicate that our mission is to the whole country. So it's about it's just a sense of generosity and a public duty, which does run through our party. And yes, sometimes we fall short, but that's the tradition we need to aspire to.
And Arlene, in general, these One Nation English Conservative MPs, indeed English Conservative MPs of all descriptions, I mean, how much do they really feel the union? I was very struck by how Theresa May's deal basically put off the question of the UK-EU border. The Irish government was going to use its best endeavours to see if we could get a solution to having a border that ran across the island of Ireland. But Boris Johnson's deal, well, it gave more regulatory flexibility to Great Britain, but there's some question of these regulatory barriers arising in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Conservative Party seemed happy enough about it. Doesn't that worry you if you're trying to search out a sense of one nation in the modern Conservative Party?
So you put your hand into the wound, Paul, if you don't mind me saying so, around the protocol. I mean, those of us who believed in Brexit living in Northern Ireland very much seen the whole nation going forward together and leaving the European Union. Of course, there were ways to deal with the issues around the Northern Ireland Republic of Ireland border. Bizarrely, those alternative arrangements are now being talked about between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, as opposed to they should have been used between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. As you know, we fundamentally disagreed with the Prime Minister on the protocol. We warned him of some of the things, unfortunately, that are coming to fruition now at the end of the negotiations around even things as simple as pre-prepared meat and the fact that that now is becoming a real problem for transport between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We warned him about the lasagna problem, but of course that was all dismissed at the time and it would be sorted out. But look, that doesn't take away from the fact that as part of the United Kingdom, I fundamentally believe in the Union. I really want to see us being more ambitious for the Union. And that's why I think things like Peter Hendy's view on infrastructure, and I know Policy Exchange has been involved in some work around national infrastructure, is highly important because Lord Carson used to say, if you are to make the Union last, then all of the people in the Union have to feel the benefit of the Union. And that doesn't matter whether you live in Wolverhampton or where I live in County Fermanagh, the most westerly constituency in the whole of the UK. We all have to feel the benefit of the Union. And I was talking about the transactional, and I think Ruth Davison refers to it, Kirsten, as the mechanical way of looking at the Union in terms of just cost-benefit analysis in terms of money. And we can do that because, of course, we will win on that argument. But there's much more that is needed in terms of emotional attachment, cultural ties, infrastructure. All of the other things need to be there as well. And I think I would just like to see us really addressing some of that in the conversation.
And Jane, we can talk about one nation or the Red Wall in a kind of elevated or strategic way, but one of the many things you said that I thought I could follow up on was just at one point you suddenly said something like, I think my constituents are going to have to get used to the idea there'll be less money around. Yeah. And I thought that was very shrewd because we've a big financial statement due. The COVID bills will come in. There's a debate going about whether we'll have spending cuts and tax rises, and if so, what? I mean, do you feel your constituents, or indeed your parliamentary colleagues, are kind of ready for this? Because you were all elected on a programme of get Brexit done and lots of spending, more police, more nurses, invest in science and all that. And now there's going to be this sharp turn of the brakes. How do you feel about that?
It is going to be incredibly difficult. And I think the optimism when we came in last year, and the optimism in places like Wolverhampton, we did think the government was really serious. The economy was in pretty good shape, and we were going to see some big spending commitments. And I think the payback of this economic fallout, it's going to be decades to sort of get back what we've just spent. But I think we can't lose that levelling up agenda. But I think it's just getting value out of the spending that the government does put into seats like mine. So it is about solutions that will get people out of unemployment. It's about that job creation and training and skills and innovation. And I think if we can focus, we do need to keep a level of spending and investment into these seats. And if we don't, we're not going to progress. And I don't think we'll fulfill our commitment to voters in the Red Wall, so or in Northern Ireland or in parts of Scotland. And I think I wouldn't like to be the Chancellor at the moment. That would be a very tough job. But I think it's about value ultimately. And we can't balk at spending to a degree, but I think we will see slightly less money, but hopefully focused in the right way.
Kirsten, I've got a variant of the kind of question I asked Arlene, except this is a bit more direct because you're working very closely with Douglas Ross. And I just wanted to read back what I thought was the most remarkable sentence of his conference speech, where he said, quote, "Many, including some who govern our country, want to see a UK government focused on England." Now, I'm not going to ask you who he meant, but I am going to ask you what you think he was getting at. It's quite a big thing to make the decision to go on the party conference virtual platform, biggest event of the year, and say that. What did he mean? And there must be a pretty big problem with English Conservative attachment to Scotland if he felt he had to say that.
Yeah, so I mean, Douglas's conference speech was a very bold move, and it was recognised by a number of people that that was the right move to make, and indeed what he was saying certainly resonated with them. And I suppose what it set out to achieve when you make a bold speech like that and you make quite bold accusations, I suppose, around your colleagues is because you want to give them a wake-up call. And where I am a passionate unionist, we are all passionate unionists, as is indeed Douglas, but perhaps quite a frustrated unionist, that, you know, we have a situation in Scotland, as I outlined, which hasn't just appeared. You know, this is, you know, the rise of nationalism in Scotland has been happening over, you know, quite a significant period of time, and over successive governments. So this speech was not aimed necessarily at Boris Johnson's government. This was around successive governments, both Conservative and Labour, who have largely governed, you know, for London and the South East, and who haven't ensured that the union is part of or is taken into consideration in every policy decision that they make and in every policy that they deliver. And I think it's really a part of, you know, what I outlined at the start, saying, well, we've been in, you know, devolution has been in place in Scotland for over 20 years. We need to look at what is working and what isn't working. And of course, as we've outlined, and as Arlene said, you know, the economic argument is absolutely there. Perhaps it's not communicated, and I don't believe it is communicated in the best form, but it's there. But we are not ensuring that people in communities across Scotland are feeling that the UK government is delivering for them. And that is the direct responsibility of ministers within the UK government, but also of, you know, the party and party members. If you're a Conservative Party member, unionism, as Douglas, I think, said, should be in your DNA. And we just feel that we haven't always seen that, specifically since 2016, but indeed, you know, before that. And, you know, things in the polls are very stark. The most recent poll, obviously, back at 51-49, but we've seen polls that have seen independence up at 55% in Scotland. You know, at what point did, you know, we wait to say, wait a minute, things aren't working in the way that they should be, and that the UK government needs to take stock of what they're doing and reevaluate and really show people in Scotland the importance of the UK government to them, their livelihoods, their jobs, their families, their community. Because if you don't do that, you're just heading on this downward spiral. You know, we're fighting against a nationalist government in Scotland, and they need to rise to that challenge.
Kirstin, thanks very much. I'm going to stop hogging the questions and go over to those of you who want to ask some. I know that the first question is from William Salomon, but I'm going to ask everyone before they come in to give their name and organisation. That's an old tradition here. So I'm going to go over to the first question, which I hope is here. I can see someone moving a hand. I think I need to ask the person to unmute, apparently. William Salomon, will you please unmute? And you can ask your question. I'm going to give it a moment, then either I'm going to ask another, I'm going to wait for another to come up on the screen. So I'm going to go in and ask another, which is on rather closer to political home, and I hope you don't mind, Jane, if I ask you. There's a great discussion around after last week's events in Downing Street about a reset. Do you think there should be a reset? And if so, what should it be?
That's a very interesting question. I am not a fan of the inner workings of, or getting involved in the rumour and gossip, and I have no idea what's speculation, what's true, and I think as far as Dominic Cummings is I think people in Wolverhampton have a positive view of Dominic Cummings. It's sort of, if you're in a Brexit community, people do like his sort of delivery on Brexit for people. So I think in South West, which was a much more Remain seat, the complaints about the Dominic Cummings incident run into thousands, whereas I had 100 in March. I know many colleagues had many more. I don't know if a reset. I think a refresh maybe rather than a reset. And I think people still have faith in the PM in Wolverhampton. People see what a difficult year he's had. His advisory team, if it needs a refresh, those things happen. But I think just not losing sight of the big agenda is probably more important to me rather than who is in the room with the PM. So,
just Kirsty, I mean, were there to be a reset in approach towards Scotland, what would it be like? Do you need a reset, a refinement in some way?
Well, I think you do need a reset when the status quo isn't working, and that is clearly the case. So, you have a number of examples where, look at the furlough scheme, a really good recent example, where the UK government decided that the furlough scheme would be rolled out for England in the period that England was in lockdown. That's not a unionist policy. That's determining that those will get support with their wages if you live in England, but actually if another nation of the country is slightly behind that, and we thankfully haven't had to take that decision yet in Scotland with a full lockdown, that doesn't mean to say we won't. Every nation is dealing with it in a slightly different way, and we can certainly criticise many of the decisions that have been made in Scotland as well as across the UK. There have been mistakes made across the board, 100%. But that was a decision that was taken without looking at the whole United Kingdom and the whole picture of the United Kingdom. And it caused a real issue for the government, and it took them a number of days and a lot of bad headlines, specifically in Scotland, to try and ensure that it was back on track. And actually, if you had departments and you had ministers that were 100% focused on delivering for every single part of the United Kingdom, we wouldn't have come up against that. And I just think that that's where this sort of wake-up call that we discussed is required, because we shouldn't be making errors like that. We should be ensuring that every policy, before it is announced, does deliver for every community across the United Kingdom and doesn't support one at the disadvantage of another.
So I'm next going to see if we can get a question from someone other than me, and see if we can get one from Robert Kilgore, whose name's come up. So let's see if we have it.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can, yes. Robert, do go ahead and do introduce yourself, name and organisation, please.
Thank you. Yes, Robert Kilgore, Chief Executive of Dow Investments. I live both in Scotland and in London, 50-50. But my question is, post-COVID-19, when we finally do emerge from all of this, will there be a need for government to introduce a new social contract for all of the amazing, hard-working and dedicated frontline staff, mainly lower paid, that will have got us through and out of this crisis?
Well, who wants to start? Danny?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. And whether it's a new social contract or a more broader public reform settlement, we do need to reflect on the change we've seen and the way that our public sector has worked this year, which is heroic in terms of frontline performance, but also more institutionally. We've seen a far greater degree of flexibility. I mean, the NHS in particular, traditionally has operated like a fortress, not good at collaborating outside its own purview and working with social care, working with community groups, working with other parts of the public sector. But this year it's done that. And so I think we actually need to turbocharge a reform agenda, which, as I said earlier, puts more power and responsibility in the hands of the people who are responsible for managing and delivering services at the front line. If we can find money for a enhanced pay package, then that's absolutely right. There has been some significant increase in NHS pay in recent years. I'm quite concerned about the social care sector, and I think they deserve not just enhanced paying conditions, but a new status in our public life and in regulation to reflect the absolutely central role that they play in our communities.
Arlene, this isn't a trick question, but a social contract, that would be a devolved matter, a matter for you in Northern Ireland, would it not?
Yes, it would. And actually, listening to Danny talking about reform, before all of this happened, and when we came back into government in January, one of our key tasks was to go ahead with our long-term reform. Raphael Bangoa came over. He did a very comprehensive report into our healthcare system in Northern Ireland and pointed up the need for change and the need for transformation over a 10-year period. And all of that, of course, has been put to the wayside at present because of COVID, but it still very much needs to be done because of our block grant, 50% of our block grant now goes on the NHS and social care. And we can't sustain that because it increases every year. And unless and until we grasp that nettle, it's going to cause us great difficulties for the future. So I think we all recognise that COVID has been one of those moments in our political and indeed our general lives, that it's been one of those moments where we have to stop and reevaluate and look around us to see what is important. For me, not to be trite about it, the union is incredibly important due to COVID. I have spoken to more Westminster colleagues over this past year than I did during the whole time of confidence and supply, Paul, and I just want to make that point. There has been great interaction between the devolved administrations. Yes, sometimes they express that they wish it could be more interactive, but we're in government, we recognise that there's a lot going on. I think moving forward is actually a good thing to look back at, the learning from more integrated, instead of Kirsten's point about devolve and forget, actually have that more integrated conversation about what is happening in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland could be very helpful for the future. And I think there's a lot of learning from each other that we can pick up as well. I certainly have picked up some issues that I can take forward from those devolved administration calls. And I think we just need to recognise the value of the union during COVID. £2.8 billion has come into Northern Ireland since March. And bear in mind that our total block grant ordinarily is 10 billion.
Kirsty, on that very point, since we're talking about one nation, on the one hand, a social contract, it sounds like one thing for the whole nation, but imagine the last thing you'd want in Scotland is a social contract written for the NHS in Scotland from London or elsewhere, surely.
So obviously health is devolved in Scotland, and that, is something that, it goes kind of back to when we were on our doorsteps and clapping each week, and, for those that were out on the front line and doing that incredible job. And actually, we need to go further than that. And yes, I think that a lot of the ideas that have been floated in this discussion so far are really important to look at, because these have been the people that have been our heroes throughout this process. And of course, they have dealt with the most difficult of situations. And it hasn't been plain sailing in Scotland by any stretch. If you look at Scotland, the size of Scotland, for example, and you compare that with other countries of a similar size, you will see that the COVID rate and death rate, very sadly in Scotland, is far too high for a country of that size. So. I just think that people can look at the pandemic and, although we can look at it and some might say, for example, that, Nicola Sturgeon's done very well in Scotland and And she's had a really kind of good pandemic, if you want to use that horrible phrase. Actually what we need to look at is the sort of day-to-day, and there's been huge challenges, in our NHS in terms of testing. There's still frontline staff that have never been tested. There are people working in ICU that haven't been tested. We had 1,000 patients that hadn't been tested move out of hospitals and into care homes. We had COVID positive patients move out of hospital and into care homes. We've had the highest care home death rate here in Scotland. So our NHS and social care has absolutely been at bared the brunt of this pandemic, and in Scotland just as in every other part of the country. And I think that absolutely the Scottish Government need to look at how we reward those that have been on the front line, have looked after everybody throughout this incredibly difficult period.
Jane, the social contract, as it were, in Wolverhampton, how do people feel, do you think, about this second big lockdown? Not quite the same as the first, but it's big. Are they more afraid? Are you getting more complaints about it? Do you feel that people are more impatient now than they were in April, and that the social bonds are fraying a bit, or not?
It was always going to be more difficult. I think once you've emerged from lockdown and you've been in a supermarket, you've been out and about and you've been fine, to then ask people to lock themselves away again, it is a very different situation to March. And I have got complaints. People are worried about civil liberties, but I think generally there is quite good compliance. Wolverhampton's coping pretty well. As far as a social contract, our NHS has done an amazing job. I have the hospital in my constituency, so I would like to see those workers sort of recognised. But also, I don't think it's just about social care and NHS workers. Other low-paid workers, supermarket workers, food production workers, they also did a heroic job turning up for work, keeping us all fed, keeping supply chain moving during the first lockdown. So I think Conservative idea, raising the personal allowance, things that help all low-paid workers, I think can reflect a broader appreciation of the people who carried on working throughout the pandemic. But I think our lockdown in Wolverhampton, we're holding it pretty well, I think, generally.
Okay, now next we've got a question from John Denham. John, are you there?
Yes. Hello, Paul.
Hello, John. Far away.
Yeah, I'm John Denham. Amongst other things, I was for a long time a Labour MP and a minister, and I have an interest in English identity and politics. And my question is this: according to the polling, a very substantial part of the Conservative majority in 2019, including in the red wall seats, were amongst voters who, when you ask them, tend to describe themselves as English or more English than British, much more than they describe themselves as British. They are strongly Eurosceptic, which is why they wanted to get Brexit done, but they're also quite union sceptic as well, and generally think that devolution has been bad for England and English interests. So my question essentially is, how does a One Nation conservatism address the Englishness of those English voters and their perceptions of the union, as well as a unionism that works across the union?
Well, we'd better start off with someone who sits for a English constituency. So that's one of you. I'll start with Jane. Jane, English nationalism and all that, what do you feel the sense you get of it is in Wolverhampton?
Thank you. I lost connection a little bit there during the question, so I hope you can hear me, but I think I got the general gist. I don't get a lot of union scepticism per se, but I think there can be a sense that Scotland, I think devolution has created a whole new set of challenges, in that there's, as with the EU, you can blame a different body, you can blame a different parliament for issues. And I think in Scotland, you can sort of blame Westminster for your local woes. And I do wonder if that's the rise of the SNP is related to that devolution. As far as English nationalism, my seat, it has historically supported UKIP and the Brexit Party. And I think people have a strong identity, but I don't get a lot of English nationalism. Maybe it's because we do have communities from Ireland and Scotland in Wolverhampton. But I think probably any resentment that is there is part of the same feeling of neglect that's been there through decades in the city under Labour governments and predominantly a Labour council for sort of 4 decades in Wolverhampton. So I don't really recognise a great deal of English nationalism.
Danny, you can see what John's getting at is, suggesting there's a strong, silent but important undertow of English nationalism in the Conservative Party and I suppose among many Conservative voters. What do you feel about that?
It might be there, and I recognise the point. I mean, John Denham's done really important and interesting work on this issue, and his point that devolution has been seen to be bad for England, I don't think that's the case. But insofar as it's a political reality, we should take it seriously, and I think it's a political reality to a degree to the degree that it is, because we are the sort of implicit deal of devolution is that we don't talk about England. We talk about the UK and we talk about the devolved nations, and England doesn't get spoken of much. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is, apart from possibly going the full federal route and establishing an English government, which I can see on paper might make sense. I'm more inclined, and I'd be interested, I don't know if John can come back on this, because he was involved in the last great attempt to do this, but actually regionalism or greater devolution within England feels to me like the right direction of travel. And I represent a bit of the Southwest. There's a strong sense of sort of Southwestern Wessex pride. I think Wiltshire deserves more identity and more power. I would like to see, I know we're having a bit of a scrap with the metro mayors currently, but I think we should get over that and increase the powers that cities have and counties. But there should be places that people recognise. I think there's a problem with nameless places that people can't identify with. So cities and counties that have good English names that people can identify with and feel. Ultimately, we don't like it when we feel powerless, and that's what Brexit was about. And we need to allow places, communities, to have a degree of agency and control.
Kirsten, I'm just going to turn this whole discussion on its head for a moment and ask you, as a former Scottish MP, advisor to Douglas Ross, you're very much involved in what's happening in Scotland. Do you ever look at England and think, it'd be much better for the Union and for our situation here if they had regional government, or if they had elected mayors with more powers, or if there was more devolution to English local authorities? Do you ever have any thoughts like that about the government of England?
So, I personally fundamentally believe that government shouldn't centralise that power, and that local authorities or local communities should be making decisions on behalf of the people that they represent. And what we have seen with devolution, which is working and continues to evolve, it is a positive thing. It's positive because decisions are made for people at a more local level. And what we tend to see in Scotland, which is perhaps the most frustrating thing about devolution in Scotland, is that all that power is centralised in Edinburgh. And what you find is that then local council and local authorities don't have that. They don't have control over a lot of the money, for example, that they might be handed, because that money has been earmarked for a policy that has been determined in Edinburgh. And actually, if we want people to see their government is working for them, then surely that means that the governments all take an approach whereby the funding and decisions are allowed to be made at a much more local level, which is much more required at that level. So rural Scotland, where I'm from, versus the Central Belt, very different. You can't make policy that will work for every part of Scotland, indeed necessarily every part of England. So I think that it is a positive move, but you have to ensure that it works and that these decisions are made at a local level. And in theory, that should provide better decisions for the people that live in that locality.
Arlene, John's question about English nationalist feeling in the Conservative Party and among Conservative voters. I mean, this isn't a new theme, is it? This is really as old as the hills to those of you who've been observing all this from Northern Ireland. Do you feel anything's really changed? Has this phenomenon got bigger, smaller, do you feel, in recent years? Has anything really changed, or is it just an undertow that will always be there?
I don't think it has grown, Paul. I think if anything, it may have fallen back a little. Obviously, the point is often put to those of us who are British living in Northern Ireland that, you know, the Brits don't want you, is the usual line that is thrown over to us. I don't accept that. I've never accepted that. There may be, particularly during the Troubles, people who thought we were more trouble than was worth. But I don't experience that, and in any event, it simply misunderstands the relationship of those of us who are British living in Northern Ireland and who want to remain so. And of course, the majority of people living in Northern Ireland still do want to, under the terms of the Belfast Agreement. I think if you look back at the decision to devolve power to Wales and Scotland and then to Northern Ireland, it was about pushing the problem elsewhere. So of course it was always thought that Labour would have a majority in Scotland and Wales, and therefore that was a good thing to do if you were a Labour supporter. It hasn't turned out like that, as we know. And certainly in terms of Northern Ireland, it was a way of dealing with very big issues around the constitution, so that if we were dealing with issues on a day-by-day basis, then it would not be as big an issue for some who were vehemently nationalist and Republican. But for me, I mean, you can have an effective devolved system, but also a strong centre as well, if the communications and, frankly, the respect is there for each of our roles in the institution. So if we respect the centre, we also expect respect to come back to us from the centre, and I think that's the important point.
Okay, next question is from William Shawcross. William, are you there? William Shawcross. If not, we'll go to the next question. It is the next question, so I'm going to go to Jonathan Rosenberg. Jonathan, are you there?
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
I can. So would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. In recent years, political polarization has undermined public confidence in the ability of our system to resolve conflict. How important do people think it is for politicians to seek common ground across party lines to build consensus in areas where they can work together to achieve shared objectives?
All right. Working together to achieve shared objectives. Arlene, this is something you've got to do in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
I might almost say whether you want to or not, isn't it?
Well, it's important to still have principles, and it's important to still believe in what you believe in. But I think what the question actually describes what I do on a day and daily basis, try and find the common ground so that we can make things happen here in Northern Ireland. Sometimes that's not very pretty. And we've had an example of that last week when we've been looking at COVID restrictions and how we move forward. But on the whole, it's about trying to find the common ground, which is not at all easy when you look at our party, which is right of centre, you look at Sinn Féin, which is very socialist, Marxist almost, and trying to find the common ground between those two places is very difficult at times. But look, we're in a 5-party coalition, we're in a mandatory coalition, that's a job that has to be carried through, and it's something I do day and daily.
And Jane, cross-party working and all that, on one level it sounds quite odd. I mean, you've just come out of not just, but less than a year ago, come out of a general election that was a study in contrast with Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. But at Westminster, you'll be involved in all-party work, I dare say.
Yes, as Danny said earlier, people just see PMQs, they just see that very combative element of Parliament, but there is a lot of cross-party working. I think in Wolverhampton, I was a city councillor before last December's election, which is overwhelmingly Labour. And so at local level, I work most effectively to try and have some consensus on some issues. But I think at this point in a pandemic, when tensions are high, people are frustrated, people are angry, I think things like the free school meals whipping up of sort of a particular point by Labour, I found that really slightly irresponsible and quite depressing, because nobody wants, there is consensus, nobody wants children to be hungry. How we address that issue should be cross-party. It should be something we can come together on. And I think most people in Wolverhampton, they want common sense, they want pragmatic solutions rather than grandstanding. So yeah, where there is scope to work cross-party, absolutely.
And I mean, Kirsten, down here, politics, very often the first thing you think of is Westminster, usually with government and opposition in this rather antiphonal way. But in Scotland, you've got a more proportional system. There are a larger number of parties in the immediate fray. There's local government. I mean, what do you feel about cross-party and non-party working? I mean, particularly, just to be very party political about it for a moment, where you've got a government and a SNP party that's never seemed to me very keen on working with anyone else.
Yes, I mean, as a member of Parliament, I always found, the most powerful debates that you were in were those that parties, the governing party and opposition party agreed. And indeed, I, was part of a number of all-party groups. I did a lot of work all-party around mental health, and you feel like you're really moving forward to get something done, and it feels it's a really positive thing. And locally, I did a lot with where party politics was not part of it. In Scotland, I think people, specifically now more than ever, want to see their two governments working together. We have a obviously Conservative Westminster government and a Scottish Nationalist Holyrood government. That makes things very difficult, because the Scottish National Party's only its sole aim is independence. We've seen that, Ian Blackford suggesting just yesterday that he wants to see an independence referendum next year. Mike Russell, Fiona Hislop, Scottish Government ministers lining up to say they want to see another referendum next year. And that's where, I suppose, part of what we've been talking about earlier, that's where people, that officials or ministers or whomever that is dealing with the Scottish Government, need to recognise that everything they do and everything they say feeds into this ultimate goal. And regrettably, we have seen it throughout the pandemic. So where the UK government has supported, whether it be through financial support, extraordinary levels of financial support, as Arlene outlined, or whether it was through testing. But actually, for example, when there was an issue with the Test and Protect app, that was blamed on the UK government testing lab. There was no issue with the turnaround of testing in the UK government testing lab. It's very easy to just criticise the UK government, and when the UK government is very slow to react, that line and that narrative then carries. So regrettably, we've still seen that division sown throughout the pandemic, and we will continue to be, because this SNP's sole focus is independence, and nothing takes away from that. The pandemic, nothing. And I think people need to be really clear that voting for them next year, that is a vote as an endorsement for a referendum, another independence referendum, and they will do it. They're not going to say, oh wait, actually there's a pandemic here, we're going to hold off for a while. Senior members of the SNP are saying this is what our focus is going to be, and this constitutional tugging is just really, really unhelpful at a time when we're still losing huge numbers of lives throughout the country. It's extraordinary that people want to focus on constitutional wrangling. And you pick up a point, Paul, about the poor proportional representation system in Scotland, which at the moment the SNP were deprived of a majority. Of course, the system shouldn't ever achieve a majority. but they were deprived of that in 2016. That was largely in fact due to Ruth Davidson's campaign and ensuring that a large number of Conservatives were returned, putting us in as the main opposition in Holyrood. But what we do have is a handful of Greens who support the SNP largely, come what may. So you think that there might be much more cross-party working, but regrettably there isn't. And when Douglas Ross or other Conservatives put forward really quite worthy policy proposals, they vote them down at every opportunity. And there is just no desire whatsoever, as much as Nicola Sturgeon says that she doesn't have politics is at the back of her mind in all of this. It's very much at the forefront. And with a nationalist government in Scotland and a Conservative government and unionist government in Westminster, we need to be very aware of what we're dealing with.
Danny, cross-party working, I'm sure you do it in Devizes, and I bet you do it at Westminster too, but I can't help asking you, how was it possible to keep that kind of erratic spirit in mind when you were doing a very sort of party political job and being Boris Johnson's political secretary? Very different sort of job to the one you're doing now.
Well, actually, my job in Number 10 was trying to get as many votes as we could for Boris's Brexit deal. So I spent quite a lot of time with Labour MPs who promised publicly to back Brexit and then didn't do it. So we tried. Kirstin and Jane have both pointed out how difficult it is to cooperate with people who are just being political, and we have seen that. That said, and there are also fundamental philosophical differences between left and right, and in the English context, Labour and Conservatives, we have different views of the world. But there are lots of areas of potentially common ground among, as it were, factions within our parties. I mean, I have much more in common, I think, on a lot of matters with someone like John Cruddas, Labour MP for Dagenham, who shares, what I've been talking about community power and trusting people locally and believing in civil society rather than big government, and actually on the limits of individualism and capitalism. I find myself in agreement with a lot of what John stands for, perhaps more than with some of my colleagues on some of these matters. So I think there is the opportunity to develop alliances across the House, and we should and do, of course, I was saying earlier, and Kirstin made the point, a lot of debates in Parliament are actually very consensual and respectful, and we do work our way through to a common position.
Danny, thanks. That's a fascinating answer, and sadly we have to wrap up. I mean, for me, this has been a reminder that you try to have a discussion about One Nation, and it can go in any number of places and in lots of different ways, and it's been none the worse for that. So in closing, I'd really like to thank three lots of people. First, my colleagues at Conservative Home and Policy Exchange, and next you, the panel, Jane and Kirstin and Arlene and Danny, for being so thoughtful over this process of an hour and a quarter. And finally, of course, to all of you who were able to join us today, thank you very much, and hope to see you again soon.